2,000 years ago, Jesus said, "I will build my church." And I come here this evening in full confidence that He has been doing that, and He is doing that in the church here and the churches that you represent. Last evening after the service, some of us were talking, and the question was raised, why, if I was raised on a farm, why am I not still farming? And I guess there's a variety of ways you could answer a question like that. You could talk about the call of God on your life and so on. But my response in the moment was it's because I was a lousy farmer. And they wanted to know some details. And I told them this. I said that one of the jobs that my brothers would trust me with was disking. You can't mess disking up too much, that's just out there tearing up the field. So I got to do a lot of disking, but even that, I said I'd be out and I'd be headed across the field, halfway across a big field, and kind of lost in the things I was thinking about and the ideas and the projects I was working on, and the CB radio would come to life, and it would be one of my brothers, and they'd say something like this: "Steven, you may want to put the disc down." In our first session last evening, we described a worldview, our worldview, anyone's worldview, as being something like a tree that is formed through the beliefs and values, what we consider to be true, what we consider to be lovely, and the nutrients that shape our set of beliefs and values. In the second session, we said that we're facing a tsunami, and that this tsunami is the worldview of this age, the beliefs and values of this age, what this age considers to be lovely and true. And that it's a powerful shaping force that is working to insert its idea of what is true and good and beautiful into our thinking. And we talked about how that only in a counter community of considerable strength do we find the power of God to resist this tsunami. And that one of the primary ways that God is resourcing us for the resistance to the spirit of the age is the community of believers. But only if we're huddling with them, listening to each other rather than tuning our ear to the dominant narratives, the dominant ideas that surround us. And so from that then, we ended with these two ideas that Anabaptism is, it has been and continues to be a counter community of considerable strength. First of all, for withstanding the current tsunami of moral defilement. And we could call this a defensive strength. It's a way God is enabling us to withstand the forces that we face. But it's not merely defensive strength, it's also offensive strength. And that Anabaptism is a counter community of considerable strength for mobilizing a reverse tsunami of Christ's followers that fill the earth with the glory of God. This was certainly true historically of Anabaptism. It is still true, I believe, to a degree, and I think God would like for it to be even more so as we move into the next years. So now in this session, well, I should say in the last 5 sessions of these 8, I want to offer 5 dishes, you might say, that are at the heart of an Anabaptist worldview. 5 emphases that help us to understand the kinds of things that Anabaptist people have cared about over the last 500 years. But before they can be served, we need to set the table just a little bit more, and then we'll dive into the 5 dishes. And in this session, 2 more things for setting the table. I want to talk about relating paired ideas, and then also spend a little bit of time talking about why I care and telling something of my story. So this first one, relating paired ideas. What do I have in mind? What am I thinking of? Well, paired ideas are ideas that go together. And there's a lot of ideas that if you talk about one, it's almost like you have to talk about another in order to be complete, to be thorough, to be to get it right. So for example, if someone is talking about the sovereignty of God, it won't be long before someone says, yes, God is sovereign, but we need to also remember that man has been given some freedom here. And so the sovereignty of God and the freedom of man are 2 ideas that we need to, how do they fit? How do we relate them? That's what I mean by relating paired ideas. We want to talk about that challenge. And there's hundreds of these. As we go through life, there's just many ideas that, how about this one? Someone might talk about doing good and how important it is to do good. But someone else, yes, that is right. We are called to do good works. But, we shouldn't just do good. We ought to let God make us good. We need to be good, not just do good. Well, those are paired ideas, doing good and being good. James 2:17, even so faith, if it has no works, is dead. So faith and works, how do they fit together? How do you relate them? Now, when I talk about paired ideas, I'm not talking about contradictory ideas. So good and evil are not paired ideas. Okay? That one, there's one that we should embrace, the other one we should not. But when I'm talking about paired ideas, I'm talking about 2 things that are both good. And the question is, how do we relate them? In Matthew 6:25, we read Jesus' words, therefore, do not be anxious, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the Gentiles seek after all these things. Jesus is giving us a reality. These things, the physical realities of life. Okay? That's the one idea. Your heavenly Father knows that you need them all. But seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. There's the kingdom of God. There's these things. How are we to relate them? Now, I'm giving this just as one more example of the opportunity we have to think about how you relate paired ideas. It's not that I want to do an exposition on this particular passage necessarily. I want us to think about our models for putting together 2 ideas that belong together. You see, we do this a lot. In fact, we've developed a whole vocabulary of how we relate paired ideas. You'll recognize some of these. I want to give you five models that I suspect at least 3 of these, probably 4 you'll have heard. Maybe all 5 you'll have heard. But it's models for how we relate paired ideas. The first one is the balance model. Have you heard about that? Oh, we need to be balanced. And you see, the idea there is that you have idea A on one side and you have idea B on the other, and you get enough of A and you get enough of B so that it I guess, points to 0. It's balanced. And we use that language a lot. Oh, if you're going to be wise, you need to be balanced. I remember as a student at Columbia Bible College, the president was giving an address to the group, and he was talking about an issue that was rather controversial, and he kept talking about, well, he didn't actually use the word balance, but it was similar. And at the end of his presentation, the moderator opened it up and said, "Does anyone have a word of response?" And I remember an older student, I think he was probably in his 40s or 50s, from India. He just stood up and he said, "I want everyone to know that balance is of the devil." Well, that got a response out of everyone. But I don't think he quite understood what the preacher was saying. What he heard with balance was compromise. And that's not what we mean here. But it does show maybe something of a bit of the difficulty with this model. And some people have observed in the balance model, you get 5 pounds of one thing and 5 pounds of another, but boy, it just equals 0 at the end of the day, and there's not a whole lot of energy in this particular model. So others have come up with models that have more energy in them. And this one maybe does. This is the boat oar model. And this one says, yeah, you have to use your imagination on my drawing there. That's a boat with 2 oars, okay? And the one oar is oar A and the other oar is oar B. And it just says that if you want to go down the stream, you're going to have to use both oars, both ideas. You pull on faith and works, and otherwise you're going to go in circles and get dizzy and never get anywhere. So the boat oar model. But again, while that one might have a little more energy in it than the balance model, some still want more energy. They say, oh no, truth it's not just balanced and blah, there's tension there. So they suggest a tension model. Now that's maybe not a word that we hear a lot, but I have heard preachers say things like, we need to keep these 2 truths in the center of biblical tension, okay? And this particular drawing comes from a physics class. If you ever had physics, one of the things you might do is have a force table here with a pin in the middle, and there's a ring, and you can put strings tied to that ring, but you have to put weights on the end so that ring is centered on the pin. And when you get the forces right, then that's what happens. In the tension model, A is pulling with all of its weight, and B is pulling with all of its weight. And that's the idea here, that if it's God and things, you pull with all of your might on worshiping God, and you also pull with all of your might on embracing the gift of God and the things that He gives us. And you just keep those 2 in tension. You pull with faith on one side and works on the other, and there's tension here. But you don't let go, because then you'd move into heresy or something. But you keep the 2 together. So the tension model. How should we relate paired ideas? Well, the last 2 are kind of different, but still relate. This one is the knife edge model. And it says that truth is found at the sharp edge of a knife. Oh, it's right there. And it's easy to get off. And so there's error A and error B in this particular model. And what we need to do is find the truth that's right there on that, some kind of a razor edge between the two errors. Well, maybe this one is the one that's most commonly used or referred to. I often hear people saying, oh, you want to stay in the middle of the road. You want to, there's a ditch on this side and there's a ditch on this side. And truth Truth is found in the middle of the road. And here we have error A and error B. This is really the same as this one, just it's a more generous view of truth than the knife edge model. So all of these models have been useful. I hear them used to help us try to think about how we relate things correctly. But I'm going to suggest that in our passage, Jesus actually gives us a different model than any of these five. You see, all five of these, and while they're helpful and useful to one degree or another, they all suffer from something. And that is, it seems as if it seems like they make both ideas equal. Now, we've already said paired ideas are both good. But is it possible that when we have paired ideas, that they're not just equal and you need 5 pounds of this one and 5 pounds of that one, or you just pull on both with equal amounts of passion and energy? Is it possible that one actually is more fundamental than the other? Both are good, but one is more basic, one is more fundamental. And clearly, in this passage, Jesus is pointing to a model that says that. So let me offer another approach, and I'm going to just call this the first and second things model. And it's pretty simple. It's really two circles. The middle one is a dashed circle, and that's intentional. And then here's where we'll put the first thing. And by first thing, we mean one of the two paired ideas that needs to anchor the other. It has priority or emphasis in some way. It's more fundamental in some ways. And then the second thing is the paired idea that needs to be kept with the first. If we're going to think correctly about reality, if we're going to live correctly, it's vital that we don't disconnect the two. Now, I use a dashed line to indicate two things. One, that the first and second thing are not the same thing. The sovereignty of God is not the same thing as freedom of man. Faith is not the same thing as works. Doing good is not the same thing as being good. God is not the same thing as things. Okay? So we use a line to say these are not the same thing. We used a dashed line to indicate that the two realities need to be kept together if we're going to be living and thinking correctly about reality. So that's the model. First things and second things. Now, clearly in this passage from Jesus, he's saying God is the first thing. And no one of us is going to disagree with that. But he's also saying the things, being physical, being embodied, being creatures that eat and work and so on, is good. It's a part of God's economy. And we are to receive it as a gift from him. But God is first, the things are second. Now, with that model, then, let's just turn to some of those other paired ideas for a moment and see if this works. Would you agree that if we're talking about the freedom of man and the sovereignty of God, that those are not equal ideas, but one is more primary than the other? Yeah. Which one's primary? The sovereignty of God. That's first. See, we don't balance those ideas. There's the first thing. We identify the first, but we also don't become so enthusiastic about the first thing that we divorce it from the second. Freedom of man is also true. What about faith and works? Are they balanced ideas, or is one more fundamental? What about doing good and being good? being good, first thing. And from being good comes doing good, okay? And I would suggest that there's likely paired ideas that are to be balanced, that are equal. But I found that a lot of these, that it's really helpful to understand which of those is first, which is second. Now, we're not quite done with this. I want us to think about, if this is the model for proper relating many paired ideas, then let's think together about ways that we mispair them, that we inappropriately relate paired ideas. So I'm going to give 3. The first looks like this. And we'll call that reversal. Reversal is when first things or second things are made first. Reversal. So let's just try to think about what that may look like in God and things. So if God is to be first and the things are to be received as a gift from Him, what is reversal? Reversal makes the thing central, makes God second. I'm going to suggest that's the prosperity gospel. It says that God is the best way for you to have a prosperous life, to have all the money you want and all the food you want. God is the means to the real end, which is financial prosperity. That would be reversal. There's a second way that we relate inappropriately paired ideas. And let's see, which one did I put next for us? Okay. That one could look like this. It's one circle, and there's first things, and there's second things. In this case, we have not distinguished them. I'm going to call that confusion. Confusion is when we make first things and second things and basically say they're the same thing. You say, does that really ever happen? Well, let's stay with our passage. What about God and things? If we make them the same thing, is that ever something we do? Well, I'm going to suggest that in some ways this seems to be the issue that Jesus was pushing back against in the first century, where the dominant perspective was that a person who was rich, if they were rich, that meant they knew God. If you were financially prosperous, therefore you were blessed by God. I think that's a form of equating. That's a form of confusing the two things. It's a way of misaligning paired ideas. The third way we can wrongly pair ideas, maybe we're going to have kind of a series here. We'll begin with this and this, and here's the first thing, here's the second thing. Now notice what we've done here is we've pulled the two apart. And then that maybe comes over here to where it looks like this. And then that comes to something that maybe looks like this. And I'm going to call this separation and divorce. In our enthusiasm for first things, we can begin to minimize second things inappropriately and say, oh, all you need is the first thing, okay? And then with time, the second things become almost a barrier to the first things, and with time, you begin to make the second things evil. So perhaps that would be a picture of sometimes in our enthusiasm for Christ and for the kingdom of God, we can begin to develop these ideas that, all I need, if I can just get to know God well enough, I won't care about the physical things of life. They won't matter. They won't be significant. And maybe we will wind up on the trying to get as far away from the physical world as we can, rather than the kind of embrace that God calls us to, that says, as we seek first His kingdom, and He gives us our daily bread, we receive it with joy, we receive it with thanksgiving, we receive it as a good gift from our Father. Now again, I give that as an illustration of relating first and second things and some of the problems that we have, but that's not the point here. The reason that I've spent some time on this, thinking about relating paired ideas, is because as we move into the emphases of Anabaptists, we're going to find that sometimes what we emphasize, it's the same thing that other Christian groups maybe emphasize, but we reverse the first and second things from what is normally done. It's not always that we're rejecting something that others are embracing. It's just that we give a different kind of emphasis. So we're going to need this first and second things model to help us understand what it is that we care about. So hopefully that will become increasingly clear as we move forward. So our task then, our task as followers of Jesus, as people who care about thinking correctly, living in alignment with Jesus, our task is first of all to keep first things first. And of course, the only way we can do that is to rely on His ability, both to teach us what's first things and to give us the power to actually live those first things. I really think that's one of the reasons that we're called to fast. Fast from food, for example. Food is one of these things. We're called to fast because that's a second thing. We fast from it not in order to wean ourselves off that we'll never need food again in our life, but we fast so that we can keep first things first and then actually receive this as a gift from God rather than it becoming a central reality for us. So fasting is not, again, to get rid of food, but it is to learn to receive it as gift. Keep first things first. Our second job is to keep second things. And that in some ways is just as difficult as the first. Because once we've identified what is first, our enthusiasm for that can cause us to minimize or deny the second thing. And so we embrace both first and second things with passion, heart, soul, mind, strength. And I include this quote from Lewis who said, and that's where I got the actual language for this model, put first things first, we get second things thrown in, put second things first, and we lose both first and second things. Now, the second part of this session, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about why I care about this subject. See, I don't remember ever questioning the truth of Christianity until I was around 19 years old. I was a volunteer at Choice Books of Northern Virginia, and one of the things that a number of us fellows like to do in the evenings was to go over to the Mormon visitors their visitor center, and we found that if you sat through their presentation and showed any interest, they would give an elder to you to talk. And so we did a lot of research on what Mormons believed, and then we'd go there and ask for an elder, and then we'd sit there and discuss. And apparently they got rather used to us coming. And so on this one evening, they said, okay, this evening, we're not going to have your group with one of us. We're going to split you up. And we're going to give an elder to each one of you to have our discussion. And I drew an elderly Mormon lady as my discussion partner. And she was very enthusiastic, and so we were going after. I was asking her questions and saying, yeah, but what about this and so on? And somewhere along the line, she says, okay, Steven, I want to give you something. She said, I want to give you a copy of the Book of Mormon. Well, you have to understand, I love books, and I was building my library at the time, and any free book that had, some kind of historic, cultural, theological merit, I wanted to add it to my library. And I thought, even though I didn't agree with the Book of Mormon, I'd still like to have a copy and so on. But she said, now, before I give it to you, you have to make a promise. And so the promise is that as you read, you will pray and ask God to give you a burning in your bosom to confirm that this book is true. And I don't know if it was right in that moment or in the next hour or the next days, but my world went into a bit of a tailspin because I had used almost an identical appeal to a group of juveniles at the Juvenile Delinquent Center in Fairfax, Virginia, to call them to read the scriptures and come to faith in what they were reading and come to God through that. And here was this lady calling me to believe in a whole considerably different understanding of the world using a similar argument. And it wasn't that I began to doubt or find some kind of reason to embrace Mormonism. I just began to question whether either Christianity or Mormonism were true. Now, that particular crisis for me was not deeply disruptive or enduring. I quickly found I was surrounded by some people who were able to help me think through some of the questions I was having. But in addition to that, some of the books that I was reading, like Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell, articles from Keith Green's Last Days Ministries, books by George Verwer, Leonard Ravenhill, and a variety of others, were really influential in kind of getting me through that crisis rather quickly. But what it did was led to a much larger crisis for me. And you'll notice that the books and the titles and so on that I described, that, well, maybe you're not old enough to know some of those, but they're not Anabaptist books. And I was listening to a lot of sermons on tape, not podcasts. This was back when you get sermons in the mail if you wanted them on a cassette tape, and you'd listen to them. And I was getting them from a local Christian college, and I was finding them to be tremendously helpful. See, I was drinking deeply from Christian wells that were not Anabaptist, that were not Mennonite. And during this time, I became a student at Columbia Bible College. Now, that's a school that bleeds missions, world missions, as well. That's their one emphasis. Their other one is the victorious Christian life. Their motto is to know Him and to make Him known. And there I was thrown in with other believers, some whose devotion to God made me question, if not my own, some of the people around me, my own devotion. And these other believers, none of them were Mennonites. And I began to wrestle with that question. What is it? Why am I a Mennonite? Is that a valid faith choice? It wasn't that I wanted to stop being a follower of Jesus, but in what tradition is best to do that? Every day in chapel, we would have sermons by gifted communicators. They pulled in speakers from all over the world, and they would teach the Bible. They would tell these dramatic stories of faith. They were convincing and compelling, and none of them were Mennonites. Every day in class, I heard learned, intelligent teachers who would convincingly and passionately describe a Christian worldview, a worldview that made sense to me from my own tradition. And none of them were Mennonites. And you can see how that would feed just a crisis for me. Why am I a Mennonite? And one day I walked into, it was my favorite instructor's office. But I was fairly new to his class, and we had not talked. I was just observing him from a distance, and I was just thoroughly enjoying his teaching. And I wanted to ask him a question. I think it was about an assignment or something. I'm not sure. And the course was world history. So I walk into knocked on the door. He says, "Come in." I walk into the office. And before I could get my question out, he goes, "Brubaker, you're a Mennonite, aren't you?" I said, "Yes, sir." And then he asked this question that's just stuck with me all these years. He said, "So tell me, how does it feel to live in a country where your freedom was bought with my blood?" And if I hadn't before, in that moment, I came face to face with the reality that my faith tradition was not exactly in the mainstream of Christian thinking. And so again, I just exacerbated I might come back to that story a little bit later. There's more to it. But for now, these were some of the pressures. So I started asking in new ways and in more intense ways, what does it mean to be a Mennonite? I knew some ways we were different. I knew we didn't go to war. I knew, thanks to my brothers and sisters, that we didn't pledge allegiance to the flag. I knew that we dressed differently in some ways. But are Mennonites just basically Baptists who don't fight and dress different? I was benefiting significantly from Christians of other denominations. And I was impressed by them. I was impressed with the quality of their presentation, but some of them I was able to observe their lives, and I was impressed with that. And when I compared my own church, my own denomination, I found we just didn't always fare too well. You know, sometimes when talking about this subject of Anabaptism with people, it's inevitable that someone will ask the question, well, okay, so there's clearly some good stuff here about Anabaptism, but we also know there's some problems. So how do we keep from throwing out the baby with the bathwater? That's the question. You've probably heard that question. How do we keep from throwing out the baby with the bathwater? Now, the way I understand that question is like this, that the baby are the good things, the good things in the tradition. And that the bathwater are the things, maybe in our history, the pieces that are not good, the things that have happened, or maybe some of the emphasis that have been a problem. That's the bathwater. So the baby is the good parts, the bathwater is the bad parts. Now, And I've found over the years that not everybody likes the question, because some will say something like this: well, there's baby here, but there's no bathwater. So how do you ask the question? It's all baby. That's this is as good as it gets. So let's not talk about bathwater. Others don't like the question because they say it's all bathwater. There's no baby left. So what do you mean not throwing out the baby with the bathwater? Just throw it all out. And then there's others that don't like the question because they say, ooh, that's too dangerous. We just need to keep both. It's too risky trying to sort through this, and we may not miss what's baby and what's bathwater, so we wouldn't want to accidentally throw out the baby. So let's just keep both. And well, during these years, my early 20s, I became a self-described expert on the bathwater of our church, Mennonites. I'd get together with my friends and we would make lists. We'd write down the things that were wrong. And there are things that are wrong. We made things that were on our list included things like how a conservative lifestyle is sometimes accepted as a substitute for genuine love and devotion for God. We talked about how our willingness to divide over seemingly insignificant differences. We talked about our disregard and disinterest for the broader world sometimes, while we put a lot of emphasis and energy into maintaining a certain appearance. We talked about how that, it seemed like in some cases non-resistance just becomes passivity. It's just a way to protect our cushy lifestyles. We talked about how that it feels like sometimes we make a big deal out of what felt to us like insignificant things while the world is going to hell. We talked about how a strong sense of community inside just seldom seems to translate into including others that aren't born into this. We would talk about the cases of sexual and physical abuse among us. And so I became an expert in the bathwater. Somewhere along the line in this, there were two significant events for me. The one was a lunch that I had with a non-Mennonite professor. And I had respected some of what I had read from him and so on, and I decided I'm just going to put it out there. I'm going to just lay out my dilemma, my dissatisfaction with the tradition that had formed me. And he listened to me. And somewhere along the line, he said this: one of the most significant indicators of God's will for your life, Stephen, is where you are. He says the parents you have, the family that you were given, the church you were born into. He says find out why God placed you there before you leave it. The other event that was significant during this time, my pastor came to me and said, Stephen, would you be willing to write an essay on why you are a Mennonite? Well, I don't think he quite understood all the struggles that I was having necessarily, but maybe he did. But both of those events pushed me to start looking for the baby and start asking, is there a baby here or not? I could name the bathwater, but I couldn't really name the baby. And one of the essays that I came across during this time of starting to look for the baby was that by Harold Bender, The Anabaptist Vision. And I've included the three primary quotes where it summarizes his arguments. He says, first and fundamental in the Anabaptist vision was the conception of the essence of Christianity as discipleship. It was a concept which meant the transformation of the entire way of life of the individual believer and of society so that it should be fashioned after the teachings and example of Christ. And I found this description of what is at the core of an Anabaptist perspective to be very compelling. I said, if this is at the heart of what it means to be an Anabaptist, then I can get excited about this. That Christianity is about following Jesus. As a second major element in the Anabaptist vision, a new concept of the church was created by the central principle of newness of life and applied Christianity. Voluntary church membership based upon true conversion involving a commitment to holy living and discipleship was the absolutely essential heart of this concept. Well, of course, the church should be made of people who are following Jesus. And third, the third great element in the Anabaptist vision was the ethic of love and non-resistance as applied to all human relationships. The brethren understood this to mean complete abandonment of all warfare, strife, and violence, and of the taking of human life. Following Jesus, the centrality of the church, made up of genuine followers. And then this idea that what God is about is making you and I into lovers, even of enemies. That began to flesh out a vision of Christianity. I said, well, yes, that's biblical, and it's something I'd like to give myself to. You see, I begin to realize that the battle in my heart and mind was actually a battle between our weaknesses as a people on the one hand and the strengths of the Christians that I was encountering. Another way of saying this is that I was comparing our bathwater with their baby. And the baby's going to always win. I sometimes say that it was education or my schooling that made a Mennonite out of me. And I don't know that that's totally true, but let me try to help you understand what I mean. You see, there was something about the schooling that I did that gave me a different set of eyes, a different way of looking at my family, my church, and the tradition that formed me. It gave me a way of thinking about them that I didn't have before. Let me illustrate. In 8th grade, I had the opportunity to tour the Savannah River site. Now that is a large government facility that was dedicated to the production of tritium for the making of a hydrogen bomb. You say, what was a Mennonite boy doing touring a place like that? Well, I was really into science fairs, and I had a number of projects that I worked on, and I would submit these for judging, and one of the awards that I received was a 2-day tour of Savannah River site. Now, please understand that since 4th grade, I had come to this awareness that I was not going to be a farmer. What I wanted to be was a scientist. Chemist, a physicist, maybe an engineer. In my mind, farming was kind of down here somewhere. Science, that was great. And so I just couldn't be more excited than to spend 2 days with the head mechanical engineer at SRS. And so Dad drove me over. I met this engineer. His name was Regan Voigt, and Dad left me there. So it was just Mr. Voigt and myself for 2 days. And he took me all the way. It was an extremely large facility, 5 nuclear reactors there. We would drive, I think in some cases, 45 minutes from one destination to another. It's the size of a county. It's a very large facility. Well, I shouldn't say facility, a very large tract of land with a whole lot of buildings spread out across the thing. And we'd go into this lab and that lab, and then he took me to their document repository that had just stacks and stacks of papers, research papers that they were doing. He said, Steven, just look through them. Any one that you want, you can take. And I was, collecting this massive stuff. I was just, it was wonderful. The second day, we're sitting there eating lunch together. I apparently had run out of questions, and he had finished the spiel that he needed to give. And so he looks across the table and he says, so Steven, tell me about your family. What does your father do? And I said, oh, he's a farmer. And Regan Voigt's response, I think, changed my life. He says, really? He's a farmer? I said, yes, sir. Oh, Steven, do you know what I would be if I could be anything that I wanted to be? If I could do anything I wanted to do? Do you know what it would be? By this time, I kind of thought I knew maybe what he was going to say. He said, I wouldn't be a mechanical engineer. I'd be a farmer. Now, do you see how that can kind of start changing your perspective? Give you a different set of eyes to look at dear old Dad? But he wasn't done. He said, oh, I'd love to be a farmer, but I'm not nearly smart enough. That'll change a young boy's perspective too. I'm not nearly smart enough. He said, oh, to be a farmer, you have to be a chemist, and you have to be an entomologist, and you have to be a metallurgist, and a whole bunch of other ists that I had no idea what he was talking. But he was saying, I can't live long enough to learn everything I need to know to farm well, so I just have to be a mechanical engineer. And that's why I say that it was experiences like that and some of the schooling that I had that gave me a whole different way of looking, not only at my family, but our faith tradition. See, I took courses there at Columbia in biblical interpretation, hermeneutics, they called it. It gave me a way to test our understanding of 1 Corinthians 11 as well as other teachings. And I found that what I had been given has good, solid, intellectually valid support from the Scriptures. But it took, in my case, it took an evangelical Bible school to help me see that. And that was repeated in other courses. And with time, I began to realize that there is a lot of baby here. Let me give you one other story. So, this is after we're married now, and we live in a mobile home community with a whole bunch of other students, and the men would gather in the evenings while we'd be watching our children play or something. We'd stand around and talk. And one time we were there, and so I'm the one Mennonite student and a whole bunch of other evangelical students, and they get to talking about church leadership. And they talk about how, oh man, the leadership in their church, it's dismal. It's a bad deal. And they were describing how that, what they do is when they need a new leader, they take applications, and people will apply from all over, and they bring them in, the best applications, they'll bring them in and they'll let them preach. And they'll think, oh, well, that person can preach pretty good. And they're with them a day or two, maybe have an interview. And they think, we think we can live with them. And they said they hire them. And 6 months into this, they said, oh, no, what in the world? We made a mistake. And anyway, they just said that leadership's a problem. And I'm quiet. I'm not saying anything. And finally, one of them said, okay, Steven, you guys, you Mennonites, y'all do things a bit different than the rest of us, so how do y'all do the leadership thing? And so I just launched in and described that, no, we don't take applications. We look from among us for leadership. And I talked about the process. And yes, I talked about the lot. Sometimes we don't know who it should be, so we'll use the lot to determine this. And these guys, they're getting bug-eyed. But I can see they're kind of enjoying this. And finally, one of them says, I'm thinking about this, and I'm convinced that if we followed it at our church, if we did what Stephen's church does, it would solve all of our leadership problems. Now, you were supposed to laugh there because we know better. But do you see how a conversation like that can start giving you a different way of looking at it? Maybe we don't have everything so wrong as I thought we did. I'm reminded of the story of the two young fish that were out for a morning swim, and an older fish coming the other direction nods to them and maybe says good morning, and then as he's passing by says, "So, how's the water?" And the two other fish, young fish, they swim on for a few moments, and then the one turns to the other and he says, "What's water?" They were so close to it, they couldn't see it. They didn't even know that it existed. And see, for me, the question was, what is Anabaptism? I was so close, I couldn't even see the air I was breathing. It was easy to see the good in other versions of Christianity, but the good in my own faith tradition was often invisible. And I suspect that most of us are a bit like that fish. The grace that God surrounds us with can often be transparent. And so, we must deliberately become grace detectors. Sniffing out, if you will, looking for the grace that God has blessed us with. No, I'm not saying we live in denial of the wrongs or create some false imaginary world, but actively looking for and naming and saying thank you for God's grace in our lives. It's so easy to completely miss the air that surrounds us and sustains our life. In my enthusiasm for becoming an expert in the bathwater, I couldn't even name the baby and describe the baby. And that's our task this weekend, to identify the grace that is present in this faith tradition called Anabaptism. To look at this question, what does it mean to be a Mennonite? What is the value here in this faith tradition? And before I go on, I want to recognize the deep connection here between our individual experiences and how we think about these questions. I've talked with many people over the years, some who have been deeply hurt by Anabaptist leaders, fathers, mothers, churches, or people in our setting. I've heard stories of emotional and spiritual, physical, sexual abuse. And it is hard when this is your story to see any good in Anabaptism. I don't want to ignore that. The failures, the sin among us should be acknowledged along with the grace. So this weekend, our intention is to look at this faith tradition called Anabaptism. And we're looking at this for two purposes: to recognize or to be grateful for, to take responsibility for the grace that God is pouring into our lives through this heritage, but also to take responsibility for our failures. And we do have, we could maybe say, a depressing amount of failures in our story as well. I intend to unpack something of our emphases by using this acronym, BLESSED. Why that? Well, because these 5 words fit that, but also because the Sermon on the Mount is one of the most formative passages of Scripture for Anabaptists, and the Beatitudes, a component of that. And of course, a repeated feature of the Beatitudes is blessed. And so for each one of the consonants, the B, the L, the two S's, and the D, I plan to offer one Anabaptist emphasis or dish, we could say. And then for each of those emphases, I want to talk about practices, I give a story, a biblical text, and a picture to help anchor each of these. I would like for us, as we end this session, to pray this prayer together. So would you stand with me? Together. O thou who was and is to come, we thank thee that this Christian way whereon we walk is no untried or uncharted road, but a road beaten hard by the footsteps of saints, apostles, and martyrs. We thank thee for the finger posts and danger signals with which it is marked at every turning, and which may be known to us through the study of the Bible and of all history and of your creation. Beyond all, we give thee devout and humble thanks for the great gift of Jesus Christ, the pioneer of our faith. Forbid it, Lord, that we should fail to profit by these great memories of the ages that are gone by, or to enter into the glorious inheritance which thou hast prepared for us through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And I'll turn it over to the song leader. So for our science lesson, Brandon, would you be able to come up and help me just a moment, please? This is a demonstration that I suspect a number of you have seen. What I'm going to do is light this piece of paper on fire and drop it into the jar. And then Brandon is going to take this egg and you're going to set it on top like that. Okay? Maybe this egg. Not sure which egg. We'll try this one. Okay? So go ahead, when you set it on, go ahead and set it in pretty good. Okay? So just but then get your hands off of it. So set it in and get your hands off. Would you do that for me? You want to try it? Nice. Okay? Now, what your job is to observe. If you can't see, you may want to stand, but I want you to observe. Now, we observe with our eyes, but we also observe with our ears and our noses and our tongues, but I'm not going to ask you to get that involved here. Okay? So observe, and then I'm going to ask you what you see. You ready to go? Okay, go ahead and get close. Go ahead and put it on. You did it just great. Thank you. What did you observe? The egg, say it again. Went down the hole. The egg went down the hole. Thank you. That's one of the best observations I've had in a while about this. Who else? What else did you observe? Did you see that? How many of you saw the egg bounce? Ooh. Okay, so the egg bounced. What else did you observe? The what? The fire went out. When did it go out? The what? When the egg was on, the fire went out. Okay. So we put the egg on, and then the fire went out. It didn't go out before the egg was on. It was after. Do you agree with him? Any other observations? The what? The egg shrank. Did you see that? Okay, but you are drawing a conclusion that it must have shrunk. But did you see it shrink? Okay, we want to be clear on these things. Any other observations? I missed that. By the way, I apologize for making y'all repeat stuff, but I don't hear the best. So, thank you. I like this. You're giving me a range. Did anybody smell something? You smelled smoke? Okay. You know, the last church that I asked to observe this, it took, I don't know, several minutes before we got to the first observation. They were doing things like, well, the air inside, the oxygen was burned up, and it pulled the egg into the bottle. Did you see the oxygen? No. And they kept wanting to give explanations rather than observations. But we'll go ahead and move to explanations now. Why did the egg go into the bottle? Based on what you observed, can you make connections as to why the egg went in? Okay, you. A vacuum was created. What's your evidence for saying that? So where's the oxygen? There's oxygen in the jar. And then you're saying when the oxygen was burned up, that created a vacuum. You're not as confident as you were a moment ago. Now, somebody's offered an explanation back here.
I said the lubricated the egg when it got warmed up.
The heat warmed the egg up, you're saying, and caused it to get lubricated, and so it was able to slip down in, kind of like putting soap on it. Well, okay, if this was a real science lesson, we would talk about what's going on. But by the way, do either of your explanations, do they explain why the egg bounced? See, what's that? And what did that have to do with anything? Or what did it pulled it in? Why did it bounce? And what caused the air to expand? The heat. Okay. We're here to talk about Anabaptism as worldview. So I've accomplished what I set out to with this, and it was not really to explain that. So we're looking at 5 words to describe the Anabaptist worldview. And the one we're going to start with is the D. Matthew 16:24, Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Who is a follower of Jesus? It's been a major question throughout the history of the church. Who's a follower of Jesus? It's been a question throughout Mennonite history. And to help us think about how our forefathers answered this question, I want us to turn to what I consider to be one of the most compelling paragraphs in Anabaptist history, and it's found in the Hutterian Chronicle. But in order to read that paragraph, we need to get the context. So I'm going to ask you to fly back in time with me through the world wars of the 1900s, through the American Civil War in the 1800s, back beyond that to the American-French revolutions in the 1700s, the wars and plagues in Europe in the 1600s, so 400 years now, go to the religious ferment of the 1500s, and we land in the year 1525. But not only do we need to go back in time in order to read this paragraph, we need to move in space. across the Atlantic, across Portugal, up through Spain, into France, and we come to Switzerland, past Geneva, past Bern, to Zurich. And here we find a priest, Ulrich Zwingli, pastor of the megachurch in town. And there we find several of his students as well. Conrad Grebel, a young nobleman, educated. He lived a rather rowdy life before committing his life to Jesus. We find Felix Mons, also well-educated, a friend of Grebel's, and also one that had joined Zwingli's Bible study. And we meet George Blaurock, a Roman Catholic priest who was converted and also began to meet with this group. They discussed matters of faith, and there were more than these, but discussed matters of faith. And in their studies of the Scriptures, they came to the conclusion that infant baptism is not really baptism at all in the way that God intended. And Conrad and Felix and some of the others came to believe that people who wish to follow Christ should be baptized after making a confession of faith as an adult who understood what they were doing and the consequences of making this choice. And while initially Zwingli would have been in line with that understanding, he said we cannot actually implement that. In the church, it would cause an uproar, but some of the other men said that was no reason to disobey the clear teaching of Scripture, the clear command of God. And however, when Zwingli took this to the government of Zurich, they agreed with him and decreed that anyone refusing to have their child baptized was required to leave Zurich. Now, in the midst of these discussions and commitments, Grebel and others met here in the home of Felix Mons' mother, and now we're ready for the paragraph. One day, when they were meeting, fear came over them and struck their hearts. They fell on their knees before the Almighty God in heaven and called upon Him who knows all hearts. They prayed that God granted to them to do His divine will and that He might have mercy on them. And neither flesh and blood nor human wisdom compelled them. They were well aware of what they would have to suffer for this. And after the prayer, George Blaurock stood up and asked Conrad Grebel in the name of God to baptize him with true Christian baptism on his faith and recognition of the truth. And with that request, he knelt down and Conrad baptized him, since at that time there was no appointed servant of the word. And then the others, in their turn, asked George to baptize them, which he did. And so, in great fear of God, together they surrendered themselves to the Lord. They confirmed one another for the service of the gospel and began to teach the faith and to keep it. This was the beginning of separation from the world and its evil ways. Well, one of the things that I wondered about as I came to understand or read more of our history was, why was adult baptism such a big deal? You know, couldn't there have been maybe a more central issue, maybe something about the theology of salvation or something like that could be at the heart of this divergence into a new faith movement? Anabaptists are actually named for this practice of being re-baptized, adult baptism. And I'll admit, I found it difficult to make a really compelling connection with this issue of adult baptism until I began to realize what all was, maybe we could say, symbolized by it. What all is actually wrapped up in this practice. And I begin to understand that following Christ involves, first of all, a personal commitment. It's a personal decision. No one can do it for me. My parents can't do it, my church leaders can't do it, and certainly my government cannot do it for me. It's a personal commitment. And that was part of what this adult baptism represented. That if you're going to follow Jesus, it's something you and I must decide. In addition, it indicates that it's a voluntary decision. It's not something that can be forced. It needs to be something that I freely choose. And following Christ involves a passionate commitment. That is, it's heartfelt. It's all of me, not just my mind. It's a passionate, whole person commitment. But also, it's radical. It's out of sync with the status quo. It gets at the heart of things. It's a radical commitment. And this too was kind of embodied in an emphasis on adult baptism. And finally, it is an adult commitment. That is, it is made with an understanding of its implications. Following Jesus is not something you can choose. It's not a commitment we can make without at least understanding something of what it means to make that choice. You see, for these people, it was not enough to be born to people who had made that kind of a commitment. It was not enough to go to church with people who had made that kind of commitment. It was not enough to be a citizen of a Christian nation, whatever that means, other than not. It was not enough to just slide in, to kind of be committed. It was not enough to merely accept Christ. Accepting is a form of personal choice that has been stripped of its deeper heart devotion and commitment. It's just mere apparent belief. A follower of Jesus is a person that has made this kind of radical, personal, passionate, voluntary, adult commitment to God. And that takes us to the first of our 5 emphases of Anabaptists. Anabaptists emphasize devotion. He said, that's the word I've chosen to try to capture all of that. Oh, it's devotion. Devotion is an ongoing, personal, voluntary, passionate, radical adult commitment to Jesus and to the people of Jesus. We could also define it as deeply held love and loyalty to Christ. For a text, Mark 12:30, and you shall love the Lord with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, with all of your strength. That's devotion. This isn't just a mind love. This isn't just some feeling love. This is all of that plus. A good picture of devotion is this drawing of Christopher Dock by Wendell Schrock. Dock was a man of devotion, a man of prayer. And we can look at this picture, we can see that. We can also, as we look at it, we can guess that he was a teacher. We see the desk, we see books there. We see a stack of papers, maybe papers that he needs to grade, to evaluate. We can also guess by looking at the picture that he lived at an earlier time where there's no overhead projector or digital projector, no computer there. There's a candle, there's a quill pen. Doc was a Mennonite school teacher here in eastern Pennsylvania. I believe, Brother John, how long ago was it that you wrote your biography on Christopher Dock? 71. Starting in 1718 is when he began to teach, and he taught from there to the end of his life, except for a 10-year break that he stopped teaching for 10 years in order to farm. Doc wrote the earliest known teaching methods text published in the United States. And one of the things we know about him is that he opened every school day with worship. He worked hard, it seemed, to make faith in God, devotion to God, a natural experience for the children. And one day he failed to return home from the skip-back school where he was teaching, and he was found there on his knees where it had been his habit to pray. He was found dead. Anabaptists emphasize devotion, but what are the practices that cultivate devotion? What do we regularly and repeatedly do that nurtures this value? And an obvious one is adult baptism. Insisting that a person is old enough to understand what they're doing serves to remind us of this emphasis. It serves to remind us that we can't coerce devotion. We can't force it. Devotion by its very nature must be freely chosen. And a second practice that nurtures devotion is family worship. A regular time when the family gathers for Bible stories, Bible reading, discussion, singing, prayer. It's a simple practice, but when repeated day after day and month after month, year after year, I think it helps to shape particularly two values. One is that regularly giving energy and attention to our relationship with God is vital. But it also shapes this value that knowing God is relational more than informational. Anabaptists emphasize devotion. But I have a question for us. How can we cultivate devotion in ourselves and in our children rather than mere conformity to community expectations? The first Anabaptists chose to follow Christ through significant wrestling. They spent a lot of time asking, what do the Scriptures teach? How should we live? What should the church look like? The devotion that formed in them was formed in the fires of praying and struggling and questioning and discussing and reading the Word and begging God for wisdom and direction. But what about their children? What is a difficult choice for one generation, and where they've wrestled with it and they embrace it in a way that produces devotion in them, their children can be just expected to embrace in a way that does not allow them, or maybe does not nurture the same kind of devotion in them. So I ask, what are the factors that lead to devotion? What are the factors that lead to generation after generation embracing anew Christ and the people of Christ in a way that we would describe as devotion? And I'd like to turn to Proverbs chapter 2 for some instruction here. He says, "My son, if you accept my words and store up my commands within you, turning your ear to wisdom, applying your heart to understanding, and if you call out for insight and cry aloud for understanding, and if you look for it as for silver and search for it as for hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God." And this phrase, the knowledge of God, is not just information about God. This is finding devotion for God, knowing God in such a way that our hearts are drawn to Him, and it's characterized by love and depth of commitment. So how does that happen? Well, the Proverbs writer begins by saying that this knowledge of God starts with, "If you accept my words and store up my commands." if our children are to become devoted followers of Christ, not just pew warmers, not just kind of Christians, but devoted followers of Christ, it's going to involve, I think, two processes. One is teaching, where we're giving true words to the next generation. And you see the Father here calling for His Son to accept those true words that He's offering. He said, I'm going to give you some teaching. You need to store it up. But that's not the only thing that He calls for. He says, I want you to accept my words, but then He goes on. So the teaching is important in leading us to the knowledge of God. But then there's also this. If you, my son, you've accepted my words, but now you need to call out for insight. You need to cry aloud for understanding. And if you look for it as for silver and search for it as for hidden treasure, then. So there's teaching. That's one of the processes that's vital here. If devotion is going to develop in the next generation, there's going to have to be good teaching, true teaching. But there's going to also have to be this searching, this calling out in each generation. You see, in the teaching, the parent is active and the child is called to be receptive. In the second, the child or the young adult is becoming more active. And the parent encourages, makes space for that process, helps them to think about how you search well, encourages the search though, calls them to the search. Look for it. Call out for it. Search for it as if you are searching for hidden treasure. Now there, by the way, is the connection with our science lesson. You see, when we bring a whole bunch of experiences, we bring teaching to a demonstration like this. And then I do something that is just a little surprising. And you say, how did that happen? Why did that happen? And it's that moment of where you're beginning to ask the questions that understanding can really begin to develop. Let me give another example of that. So, you know magnets. You already have teaching about magnets. I don't need to teach you about magnets. You have that. You know about copper pipes. This is a normal garden variety copper pipe, other than the fact that it's a pretty thick wall. And you also know by experience how fast things tend to drop. Now, all I'm going to do is drop this through this. And I'll do that. I'm not doing anything sleight of hand here, okay? I'm just going to put it in and drop it. And you're saying, I wonder why that was. And that's the process that the Proverbs writer is talking about here. This is when you start searching. Wait a minute, what's going on? I didn't think things worked that way. And you say, oh, there has to be something with magnetism. Well, let me tell you, magnets and copper don't attract. If we're going to come to the knowledge of God, if we're going to come to devotion, if we're going to come to understanding in just about any realm, we have to search. And the example that the Proverbs writer gives, he says, you have to search for it like you're searching for hidden treasure. You have to search for it like you're searching for gold. I mean, this can't just be some kind of type of, oh, could you tell me what's going on? No, it's, I have to know. That's the kind of passion that the writer here is calling for. You see, when my children are small, I give them teaching. I say, Jesus loves you. And That's teaching for them. And they accept that. They receive that. But they get to 15 and something happens to them that's tragic. They lose a parent and the struggle is on for them. Wait a minute. I was told that Jesus loves me. How can that fit with this terrible thing happening in my life? And the search is on. That's absolutely vital for moving toward the knowledge of God, for moving toward devotion, to moving to the kind of commitment that our forefathers made. And this picture of searching for hidden treasure, that came real to me when we visited the South Dakota, the Badlands, Mount Rushmore, and so on. You remember one of my heroes was Sitting Bull? And so in 5th grade, I wanted so desperately to go visit the land of Sitting Bull. And I wrote to the people in South Dakota, the tourism office or something, and they sent me back a whole big packet of information. And so I planned out a trip. Wasn't able to take it until just a couple years ago, and we took our family out there. And we were here, but I don't want to talk about Mount Rushmore. What I want to talk about is this. This is the Big Thunder gold mine that's at the base of Mount Rushmore. It's made out of the same kind of rock as Mount Rushmore. Now, Mount Rushmore was chosen by Borglum as the place to do the carvings because he wanted a hard rock. He didn't want to do all this carving and then have the water wash it away in a couple years. So he chose a very, very hard rock mountain to carve it in. This is at the base of that mountain. This particular gold mine was blasted out by 2 men. And if you go there, you can hear their story, how they dug this mine. Now, on either side of this particular mine, there were 2 big mining companies. They had lots of money, lots of people, and lots of equipment. And they were able to dig back into the mountain, and I don't know how long it took them, but they dug back in, and they said, you get 25 feet in, and there's a vein of quartz, and there's gold in that quartz. And so these 2 guys that owned the plot in between, they said, let's start digging. Now, they were very poor, so they had to work during the day to make a living, but at night they would dig. And they told us how they would dig. They would take a piece of iron, it was a bit about this long, and the one guy would lay it on his shoulder, and he would back up against the mountain wall, and the other guy had the sledgehammer, and he would hit on the end of that bit, okay, and it would chip away a little bit of the rock. Now, they said since they were doing it at night, and since they didn't have LED lights and all that kind of stuff, they had just flickering lanterns. The guy holding the bit was expected to put his thumb on the end of the bit. And as he would press it, that white would reflect the light and gave the guy with the sledgehammer something to aim for, which is the problem, right? But so he's there and he's holding it, and then when the sledgehammer's coming, he pulls his thumb down. That's the idea, anyway. And so they would get a little chip off and a little bit more, and they'd go in 8 inches. And then they would have to do another. They made a pattern of 16 holes, I believe it was. And get back 8 inches, pack that with dynamite, blast it, and you'd have 8 inches in. Now, they had to go 25 feet. They said it took them 12 years. Actually, I think it was 50 feet to go to where they got their vein. It took them 12 years to do this. But that's the kind of energy and passion that the Proverbs writer is calling us to in our search for wisdom, understanding, the search for God. He says that's what we need to bring to this. And that's what we need to be calling each other to and our children to if they're going to be devoted. Well, okay, I'll finish it. So they got back there, and don't you know their vein of gold or their vein of quartz had no gold in it. So they gave up, went back to their day job. But remember the guys on the other side? About this time, they got back in another 75 feet. And they said, oh, there's a big vein back here. And so these 2 guys got started again. Took them another, I think they were better this time. It took another 12 years, 25 years in all till they got back to that vein. And yes, there was gold. He said about $200 worth of gold. 25 years of their life giving themselves heart and soul to finding that. What are we going to give to find the knowledge of God? Anabaptists emphasize devotion. That's the first of our 5 words. Tomorrow evening and Sunday evening, we'll take 2 each evening, a session for each. And now, another story to end. So 1525 was the beginning of the Anabaptist movement. This is a story that takes place in South Germany and is 10 years later, 1535. Some of the South German Anabaptists left their homes because of mild persecution and went down the Danube River to Moravia, where they felt like they would be more welcomed, and there was indications of that. And there in Moravia, they settled in some farm colonies of 200 to 300 people. But here in this place that they thought was a safe haven, once again, the authorities said, "We don't want you here," and they were forced to leave. And so they head back up the Danube River, headed back toward their home. I think there was some uncertainty about what they would do, but before they made it back, they were stopped along the way in Passau and imprisoned here in this castle that you see pictured. The authorities brought them to trial, but there was no sentence given. And so they were there, just kind of hung between, we don't know what's going to happen to us. A very few of them were released, a few recanted. Most of that original group died in prison. It was an incredible injustice. But these Passau prisoners passed their days by keeping each other's spirits up, by quoting scriptures to each other, by praying together, and by singing. And as they sang, they began to bring some new songs into writing some new songs. And in fact, during the first 5 years, from 1535 to 1540, they produced a collection of 51 hymns, and those 51 hymns came to form the hymn book that we know as the Ausbund. Soon those hymns made it outside of the prison and were widely circulated as handwritten copies before they first were published some 30 years later in 1564. As we know, this continues to be the hymnal for the Amish. It's the oldest Christian hymnal in continuous use from the 16th century to the present day. And these 2 editions there at the bottom, the black one was published in 1564, and the one on the right was published in Germantown in 1751. But the Ausbund is one of our symbols of devotion. Why do I say that? I want to just give 2 quotes. Things that were sung by this group of people who are willing to follow Christ and can stay in their commitment to Christ even though it meant a languishing death. They said, "Eternal Father in heaven, I call to you from my innermost being." Notice that whole person commitment. "Do not let me turn away from you. Keep me in your truth until the end. O God, keep my heart and my mouth. Watch over me every hour. Do not let me turn away from you because of anxiety, fear, or distress. Keep me steadfast in your joy. I lie here in chains, waiting on you, God, with a very great longing for the time when you will set me free." Devotion. And then this one. "We don't serve God out of compulsion, but out of free love. Since He is our Lord, we should offer Him spontaneous devotion." Anabaptists emphasize devotion.